Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 7 stories for you, including the voicemail of the winter breath, the somnambulist's log, the sitter of the summit, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The voicemail of the winter breath. I never intended to tell you this story, but now that it has begun, I find I cannot find the words to end it without making your own sleep feel a little heavier. Tuesday was hollow. The hour between midnight and dawn felt like the world was holding its breath. My boots clicked against the pavement of a dead-end block, dry, rhythmic, lonely. Then came the chill, a sudden blade of ice that forced me toward the corner store. Its neon sign hummed, a frantic heartbeat in the dark. I stepped inside. The bell chimed once and died. The shop smelled of toasted bread and old wax. It was nearly empty, but the air wasn't just cold, it was dense. A mist began to coil around the bulbs. It didn't drift, it clung. It coalesced into frost-white vapor, suspended like frozen ink. These were my thoughts, the ones I had buried in the cellar of my mind. To my left, a cluster of mist sharpened into hunger. To my right, it braided into forgive. I stood paralyzed as the air began to thrum with a low, melodic vibration. From the deepest shadows at the back, a sound emerged, the mechanical click of a tape recorder. It wasn't a machine. The walls themselves were speaking. "You are standing in the center of the aisle," the voice whispered. It was my voice, pulled through layers of velvet. I blinked. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. The air is thick with things you kept inside. The winter breath accelerated. It swirled into a frenzy, crystalline particles tasting of peppermint and old snow. The fog became a blizzard of secrets. "I am afraid of being forgotten," one swirl hissed against my ear. "I still regret the way she looked at me before I left," another murmured from the ceiling. The store began to shrink, the walls pulsing with a bruised, blue light. The hum of the refrigerator made my teeth ache. The voice reached its crescendo, capturing the exact tilt of my head, the throb in my calves, the precise weight of the moment. "You are listening now," the voice said, perfectly synchronized with my pulse. "And you are beginning to understand that the breath is not just yours." The words multiplied until they were a physical weight against my chest, a crushing mass of every almost, and perhaps, I had ever swallowed. Then, with a violent intake of air, the breath collapsed inward. The blizzard vanished into a single, dense sphere of frost hovering before my face. Silence fell. The neon died. The hum ceased. I reached out. My fingertip broke the surface of the sphere. It didn't shatter. It rippled like dark water. Inside, a miniature store appeared, and inside that store, a tiny version of me stood in an aisle, staring at a sphere. The voice spoke one last time, vibrating directly inside my skull. "I am waiting for you to say it." The frost exploded outward, engulfing the shelves, the floor, and my vision until everything was white. When I opened my eyes, the store was gone. I was back on the dead-end block, the air biting at my skin. But as I turned to walk home, I felt it. A thin ribbon of winter breath trailing behind me like a loyal shadow, silently spelling out the word always in the space just above my heels. The Somnambulist's log. I am the last one awake. The 4 other researchers have already been claimed by the silence of the laboratory, their chairs overturned and their pens scattered like fallen bones across the linoleum. I sit alone at the central console, my pen trembling as I record the final entry for Subject 42, the stranger who arrived 3 weeks ago with nothing but a suitcase and a profound, uncharacteristic stillness in his posture. He was a volunteer for our subconscious mapping project, a long-form study of the human mind during deep REM cycles. We wired him to a forest of electrodes, nestled him into a cradle of silk sheets, and let the machines hum their rhythmic lullaby. For 12 days, he slept. For 12 days, his body was a vessel for something else to inhabit. The most baffling data didn't come from his brainwaves or his rapid eye movements. It came from the bedside telephone we placed within arm's reach of his head. Every morning, when he woke, we would find a new list of numbers dialed on the rotary dial, though he never moved a muscle during the night. He remained perfectly still, Yet the bell chimed incessantly in the dark. Yesterday, I began to notice a pattern. The calls weren't random. They were specific. Each number corresponded to a different floor of this very laboratory, and each call occurred at an exact microsecond of his deepest sleep. As I analyzed the log for the final night, my heart hammered against my ribs. He had called floor 140 times, floor 212 times, and floor 3 only once. But it was floor 4 that haunted me. On the very last hour of his sleep, he dialed the number for floor 4 exactly 99 times in a frantic, rapid succession. I decided to investigate the source of these calls. The laboratory is a vertical stack of rooms. Floor 1 is where we sit. Floor 2 houses the archives. Floor 3 holds the centrifuge and cooling units. Floor 4, however, has been empty since we moved in. It is a hollow space, filled with nothing but dust and heavy air. I stood at the threshold of the elevator, my breath hitching as the door slid open. I took the ride up, the mechanical groan of the cables echoing in the shaft. When I reached floor 4, the silence was heavy, almost tactile. It felt like a weight pressing against my eardrums. I stepped out into the center of the room and looked toward the far corner. There it was. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a pile of discarded masonry, a heap of irregular, geometric blocks stacked haphazardly like a broken castle wall. The blocks were a dull, matte ochre color, textured like rough sandstone. But as I focused my gaze on it, the structure began to behave strangely. It didn't move with fluid grace. Instead, every block shifted and tumbled independently. When I stared directly at it, the heap remained stable, crumbling slightly inward as if yielding to my observation. Then I did what we often do when we are startled. I blinked. The moment my eyelids closed for a fraction of a second, the blocks didn't just tumble, they erupted. In the blink of an eye, the ochre pile sharpened into a towering, jagged spire of crystalline edges. It grew tall, its sides becoming razor-thin and gleaming like polished flint. Every time I looked away, it surged forward with a series of tiny, grinding clicks, reforming itself into a complex, multifaceted pyramid of sharp angles. It was as if the entity were afraid to be seen in its true, jagged glory, preferring to collapse into a humble pile of stones whenever a witness dared to watch it. I took a tentative step forward and whispered, "Who are you?" The heap instantly collapsed back into its dull, sandy form. I held my breath, staring at the matte ochre surface with unyielding intensity. It stayed still, but then I felt a sudden, sharp draft of cold air hit my cheek. Without looking up, I heard a sound, a crisp, metallic snap. The entity had moved while I was blinking. When I finally forced my eyes open again, it wasn't a pile of blocks anymore. It was a towering wall of spikes, and they were all pointed directly at my face, vibrating with a low hum that made my teeth ache. The sitter of the summit. I have worked at the Peakview Ski Resort for 3 seasons now, and I have learned that there is a peculiar rule to the late-night shifts. When the chairs stop humming and the crowds vanish into their warm lodges, the mountain belongs to the quiet. Or so we think. My job is simple. Sit in the observation lounge, watch the snow fall against the panoramic glass, and ensure the fireplace stays lit. It is a meditative task, but for the last month, I have felt like I am never truly alone. Every night, there is a presence beside me. I can feel the weight of it on the velvet sofa, a slight dip in the cushion to my left as if someone were leaning in. Yet, whenever I turn my head to see who it is, there is only empty space and the soft glow of the embers. At first, I thought it was a trick of the cold or a lingering ghost of a tourist. But then came the shift with Elias, the new intern. He was terrified from the moment he started. "Don't look at the seat," he whispered on his 3rd night. "Just let him sit there." I laughed at first, thinking it was hyperbole until the 4th week when I saw a flake of frost land on my own shoulder, while the spot next to me remained perfectly dry. Then I noticed the tiny details, the faint smell of damp pine needles that only appeared when the lounge fell silent, and the way the temperature would drop 3 degrees in a specific radius around my left side. One Tuesday, during a particularly heavy blizzard, I decided to test the theory. I stopped trying to ignore the sensation and tried to find the source. I realized that whenever I blinked, or even for the microsecond it took to process a thought, the presence moved. It was as if it existed only in the margins of my perception. To prove it, I held a small brass bell in my right hand. "If you are there," I whispered into the shadows, "ring it." The room remained still. The fire crackled. Then I closed my eyes tight for 3 seconds. When I opened them, the velvet cushion was no longer indented. The seat was flat. The pine scent vanished. It had retreated to its corner. Every night since then, I have played a game of hide-and-seek with it. I learned that it is an entity of motion and stillness, a creature of the in-between. It doesn't just sit, it inhabits the space where my attention isn't currently fixed. One evening, I grew tired of the guessing game. I decided to see if it could handle a continuous gaze. I sat perfectly still, my eyes wide, staring at the empty cushion next to me. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. The seat remained vacant. Then, a tiny ripple moved through the air. A small, humped shape began to emerge from the fabric. It wasn't a man or a woman. It was a creature covered in iridescent, moss-colored fur that looked like velvet lichen. It had 3 distinct joints on its limbs and a face that resembled a smooth river stone with 4 horizontal slits for eyes. It didn't have a mouth. Instead, it had a series of vibrating gill-like structures along its jawline. It moved with a strange, jerky grace, shifting from the cushion to my lap in the blink of an eye. I held my breath, afraid that if I exhaled too hard, it would vanish back into the corner. But it stayed. It pressed its stone-like face against my forearm, and for a moment, we were both aware of each other. The fur felt cool and slightly damp against my skin. Then, the fire popped a sharp, sudden crack that made me jump. In that fraction of a second, the creature vanished. I looked down to find it gone, having retreated back to its hidden corner. It was no longer just a feeling, it was a neighbor. To help myself remember its nature and warn those who would follow my shift, I wrote a small rhyme on the back of my clipboard, hanging it by the door for the next worker. "Silly shadows sleep so silent, / underneath the mountain's light. / if you blink, he finds your shoulder, / moving through the winter night." The creature is still there now, even when I am not watching. It waits for me to look away, and in those stolen moments of transition, it inches closer, finding its home in the gaps of my sight. The Cartographer of the Submerged. I am telling you this because I know you are listening, even if your face remains a blur on the other side of the glass. You don't need to speak. Just receive my confession as the water closes over my head. For years, I lived in a house that felt like a living organism. Every morning, I would wake up and find the neighborhood map pinned to my bedroom wall, a hand-drawn grid of the streets surrounding my home. But every night while I slept, the map rearranged itself. One night, the cul-de-sac would stretch into a mile-long straightaway. The next, a forest path would sprout where a bakery used to be. The houses moved, shifted their positions, and occasionally sprouted new windows or extra chimneys, as if they were growing like cells in a petri dish. I grew obsessed with these nightly revisions. I began to notice that the more complex the map became, the heavier my own limbs felt. It was as if my body was being mapped by the same invisible hand that redrew the streets. The transformation reached its peak last Tuesday when I woke up and realized the map had turned entirely blue. The streets were no longer lines of ink, they were veins of water. I looked out my window and saw that my garden had been replaced by a vast, flooded plain. The ground was submerged under 3 feet of crystal clear water, and the trees stood like drowned giants. That is when I first heard it, the sound of a rhythmic, heavy dragging noise coming from the hallway. It wasn't a footstep. It sounded like something thick being pulled over smooth stone. I stepped out into the corridor, my feet splashing through the rising tide that had begun to seep through the floorboards. The water was cold, smelling of minerals and ancient silt. That is when I saw him. He stood at the far end of the hall, perfectly still. He was not a ghost, nor a mere shadow. He was a creature of impossible clarity. While everything else in the hallway, the walls, the ceiling, my own hands, seemed to be melting into soft, watercolor smears of color, the entity remained razor-sharp. He was shaped like a tall, angular tripod with 3 distinct limbs that joined at a central torso. His skin had the texture of hammered copper, and his head was a smooth, seamless oval without any features except for a single, glowing horizontal slit across the middle. Because he was so sharp in definition, he looked as if he had been cut out of reality with a pair of scissors and pasted onto a blurry painting. He didn't move toward me. He simply existed in the space, his copper skin catching the dim light like a new coin. As I watched, the water rose to my waist. The map on my wall began to vibrate, the ink lines dancing like frantic worms. "Who are you?" I whispered, though my voice felt muffled by the weight of the liquid. The entity did not speak with words. Instead, it leaned forward, a movement so precise it felt like a needle-piercing fabric. As it moved, the surrounding walls bled into shades of violet and gold, becoming soft blurs, but the entity remained a hard-edged fact. It reached out one of its copper limbs and touched the surface of the water. Where its tip met the liquid, the water didn't ripple. It turned into solid glass. The entity was carving my world, refining the messy blur of existence into something tangible. I realized then that he wasn't just a resident of the map. He was the architect. He was taking the smeared parts of my life and sharpening them into permanent shapes. The water reached my chin now. The house was no longer a house. It was a cathedral of submerged geometry. I could see the map on the wall one last time before it dissolved entirely into a single point of light. The entity moved closer, its copper body shimmering. It didn't have eyes to look at me, yet I felt its scrutiny. It was refining my face, pulling my blurred features into sharp, jagged lines. My skin began to harden into metal. My hair became a series of distinct, pointed needles. Every part of me that wasn't the entity began to lose its edges, melting into the surrounding water until only his copper body and my new, sharpened face remained. He reached out and pressed his oval head against mine. For a second, there was a sound like a bell being struck deep underwater. The water surged one final time, swallowing us both. I am no longer drifting in a house. I am a permanent mark on his blueprint. He is still here now, standing in the center of the submerged street. He hasn't moved for 1,000 years, yet he continues to redraw the edges of my soul. The water is still, and the blur has finally stopped. I can feel him reaching out again, his copper limb moving to sharpen the very next second of my existence. He isn't just watching me. He is carving the moment I will eventually disappear into his design. And as I look at his perfect, sharp outline, I realize that there is no room left for anything else to be soft. The echo in the grain. You asked me why I still think about that final night at the Oak Haven feed mill. It wasn't just the smell of toasted wheat or the hum of the machinery dying down. It was the way the silence felt heavy, as if the building were holding its breath before a long sleep. The air carried a dry, powdery sweetness, the ghost of 1,000 harvests lingering in the rafters. We were a team of 5, just technicians and laborers tasked with overseeing the very last shift before the gears would stop turning for good. To commemorate the closing, we decided to take a series of group photos throughout the night, a way to trap the dying pulse of the mill in silver and shadow. I remember the air was thick with floating dust motes, catching the amber glow of our lanterns like tiny, suspended sparks of gold. We stood in the center of the main processing floor, surrounded by towering silos that felt like hollow rib caves, their curved walls echoing with every footfall. We laughed, struck a pose, and the shutter clicked. When we looked at the first print, something felt slightly off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was a sense of symmetry that wasn't quite perfect. In the background, near the far rusted conveyor belt, there was a smudge of shadow. It looked like a blur of texture, almost as if the dust had clumped together in a human shape. We dismissed it as a trick of the light, a mere phantom born of weary eyes. But then we took the second photo, closer to the grinding stones where the floor was polished smooth by decades of falling grain. The shadow was clearer now. It wasn't just a smudge, it was a figure standing perfectly still in the periphery of our group. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense, but rather a surface of overlapping scales that shimmered like oil on water, catching the lantern light in iridescent ripples. Its limbs were thick and muscular, ending in wide, flat palms that seemed to reach for nothing. Most unsettlingly, it was mimicking my exact posture, My left hand was raised toward my chin, just as I had held it in the pose. "Is that a person?" someone whispered, their voice cracking slightly in the vast space. We laughed about it then, thinking it was a trick of the perspective or a clever trick of the lens. By the third photo, the atmosphere shifted perceptibly. The air felt colder, a sudden draft weaving through the silos like an invisible finger tracing the floorboards. Even more bizarrely, the rhythmic clicking of our lanterns seemed to echo twice for every one strike, a secondary pulse following each snap of light. We took the next shot near the sorting chute. In this reflection, the figure was no longer in the background. It had moved closer, invading our personal space with a slow, deliberate grace. Its body was a perfect mirror of mine, but there was a subtle, maddening lag. While I was grinning at the camera, the entity's mouth was still slightly open as if it were finishing the smile from a second ago. It was copying me, but it was always one heartbeat behind. It possessed a peculiar grace. Its joints didn't bend like ours, but rather unfolded like a pleated fan, smoothing out the transitions between movement and stillness. We took the fourth photo, and my heart began to thrum against my ribs like a trapped bird. The entity was now just 3 paces away, looming over us with an attentive intensity. Its scales were vibrating, producing a low hum that vibrated in our teeth, a subharmonic frequency that seemed to make the very floorboards tremble. It mirrored my slight lean to the right, its torso twisting with a fluid, liquid motion as if it were made of mercury rather than bone and scale. I realized then that it wasn't just copying my shape. It was stealing my rhythm, drinking in the way I moved through the world. By the 5th photo, we stopped laughing. The playful energy of the evening had evaporated, replaced by a thick, reverent tension. We stood in a line, paralyzed by the realization of its progress. The entity was now directly behind me, its wide palm, hovering just an inch from my shoulder blade. It mirrored the way I held my breath, though its own chest remained expanded as if it were inhaling the very space I occupied. In this final photograph, our faces were almost touching. My eyes were squeezed shut in anticipation of a contact that felt inevitable. When we developed the print, the entity's face, that shimmering landscape of scales, was perfectly aligned with mine. Its mouth was open, capturing the exact moment I had exhaled. It didn't just copy me, it occupied the space I left behind. As the last grain fell and the mill lights flickered out, plunging us into a gray twilight, I felt a sudden, sharp pressure on my spine. Without looking back, I felt the entity's wide palm press against my shoulder blade, capturing my final gesture of exhaustion. It didn't wait for me to move. It waited for me to finish, then took over. Now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel that weight. The mill is silent now, but I know the entity is still there, waiting for the next person to move so it can follow exactly 1 second later. The echo of the exit. 2:14 a.m. The asphalt is a vein of charcoal under my headlights. I am driving the old county road, the kind where the trees lean inward as if trying to eavesdrop on the hum of the tires. There are no streetlights here, only the rhythmic pulse of high beams cutting through the heavy, humid air. 2:18 a.m. A sign looms out of the mist, rest area, exit 42. It is a lonely slab of weathered wood positioned at an angle that feels almost intentional. I pull over. The silence that follows the engine's death is heavy, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. 2:21 a.m. I step out into the cool air. The restroom building is a squat, concrete structure with a roof of rusted corrugated metal. It looks ancient, its yellow paint peeling away in long strips like dead skin. 2:23 a.m. I enter. The floor is tiled in a checkerboard pattern of faded seafoam green and white. There are 4 stalls, each with a heavy door that groans when swung open. I walk to the furthest one. 2:25 a.m. Something feels wrong about the ceiling. Above the sink, the plaster has cracked, revealing what looks like a map of the night sky. But these aren't just random stars. They are grouped into distinct clusters. The first cluster forms a perfect triangle in the upper left corner. I find myself squinting at them. They seem to pulse with a soft, internal light, independent of any lamp. 2:28 a.m. As I wash my hands, the water comes out in a steady, lukewarm stream. While I watch the bubbles pop, the constellations shift. The triangle in the corner expands, its vertices stretching toward the center of the ceiling like 3 points of a compass. In the middle of this new formation, a single star ignites, a brilliant, violet spark. 2:31 a.m., I look up and feel a sudden prickle at the base of my neck. The stars aren't just moving, they are forming words. I cannot see letters yet, but I can sense their shapes. They are shifting like molten glass. I notice that the violet spark is vibrating slightly, humming a low frequency that resonates in my chest. 2:34 a.m. A sound comes from the stall behind me. It isn't a footfall or a door creak. It is a voice. It speaks with perfect clarity, yet it sounds muffled, as if coming from beneath the floorboards. Are you ready? The voice is mine. It has my exact pitch, my slight rasp at the end of vowels, and my peculiar way of lingering on the letter S. 2:36 a.m. I freeze. My breath hitches in my throat. I turn toward the stall door. There is no one visible through the crack, but the voice speaks again from the same spot. The stars are hungry tonight. Again, my own voice. It isn't a recording. It has the slight inflection of a conscious thought, a weary sigh woven into the tone. 2:38 a.m. I step toward the stall. The door swings inward on its own. Inside stands an entity that defies easy description. It lacks a face in the traditional sense. Instead, its head is a smooth, polished sphere of iridescent pearl, roughly the size of a melon. From this sphere, dozens of thin, golden filaments sprout like grass, swaying even though there is no breeze. Each filament ends in a tiny, glowing bead that mimics the constellations on the ceiling. 2:41 a.m. The entity doesn't move its body, but its filaments begin to dance. They weave together, tracing the path of the stars above. Don't look at the horizon, my voice says from the pearl head. It sounds amused. Look at what is between the points. 2:43 a.m. The constellations on the ceiling suddenly accelerate their movement. They spin into a frantic whirlpool, then snap into a final, rigid formation. The violet spark expands until it occupies the entire center of the ceiling. The filaments on the entity's head all point upward at once, vibrating so fast they become a blur of gold and light. 2:45 a.m., I feel a pull, a literal tugging sensation in my solar plexus, as if something is drawing me toward the ceiling. The voice speaks one last time, no longer a question, but a statement of fact. It has been waiting for you to notice. My own voice sounds. Closer now, not coming from the entity, but from directly behind my left ear. 2:47 a.m., I turn my head quickly. There is nothing there, no face, no body. Just the lingering scent of ozone and whetstone. The entity in the stall has vanished, leaving only a faint trail of golden dust on the floor. 2:50 a.m., I rush out of the restroom and back into the car. My hands are shaking as I grip the steering wheel. I look up at the ceiling of the car for a split second before shifting into drive. The constellations on the roof have disappeared, replaced by the mundane gray of the fabric. 2:53 a.m., I start the engine and pull back onto the highway. The mist is thinner now, but the silence feels different, heavy with the weight of what I saw. As I drive, I realize that the voice wasn't just a mimicry, it was a rehearsal. 3:01 a.m., I glance at the dashboard clock. It stops ticking for 3 seconds, then resumes. In those 3 seconds, my own voice whispers from the empty passenger seat, "Wait for the next one." The passenger of the Perpetual, Washington. It started as a mundane Tuesday, the kind of afternoon where the humidity clings to your skin like a damp wool blanket. I pulled my sedan into the ever-clean tunnel, a sprawling car wash that promised a deep scrub for every vehicle. I expected the usual sequence, the heavy rumble of the machinery, the rhythmic slap of brushes, and the satisfying final spin of the dryers. But as the water began to spray, something shifted in the atmosphere. The overhead lights flickered, and the roar of the motors deepened into a low, vibrating hum that felt less like mechanical power and more like a collective breath held deep in a giant's lungs. I reached for my phone to check the time, but the screen was already flickering with incoming texts from my sister, Clara. They were arriving in bursts, overlapping each other before I could even finish reading the first one. "Did you get in?" she sent. Then the car is moving. Finally, wait. Why are you still in there? The messages arrived almost simultaneously, a jumbled mess of sequence. Outside, the brushes began to rotate, but they didn't move past me. Instead, they stayed perfectly positioned at my front bumper, spinning with frantic intensity while the water pooled around the tires. I looked toward the back of the tunnel and saw them, the crowd. They were standing along the walls, a dozen figures in various states of stillness. They weren't ghosts in the traditional sense. They were silhouettes of varying heights, each possessing a soft, amber glow as if they were lit from within by a dying hearth. Then I noticed their eyes. Every single one of them had the same golden iris, and every single one of them moved at the exact same millisecond. When I blinked, they blinked. When I turned my head to the left, all 12 pairs of eyes pivoted in unison toward the sound, tracking my movement like a school of fish following a single leader. It was an uncanny, predatory coordination that made my stomach lurch. They weren't just watching me. They were reacting to me as if they shared a single brain. Then came the entity. It emerged from the back of the tunnel, moving with a slow, fluid grace. It didn't have a solid face or distinct limbs. Instead, it was a warm outline, a shimmering, molten gold shape that seemed to hold the lingering impression of whoever had occupied its space last. At this moment, it held the perfect silhouette of a person sitting in an armchair, leaning slightly to one side as if reading a book. It wasn't just a shape, it was a memory-given mass. The outline pulsed with a gentle heat, and where it moved through the air, it left a faint trail of golden dust that settled on the wet pavement. As the entity approached my car, the crowd's eyes locked onto it. They stopped moving their heads independently and leaned forward in perfect synchronization. The hum of the machines reached a fever pitch. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, as if the air was being sucked toward the entity. It reached the driver's side door and paused. The golden outline shifted slightly, losing its armchair shape and becoming more defined. It began to stretch out, reaching toward me. My phone buzzed again. Clara's texts were coming in backwards now. It looks at you, followed by you see it, then is it close? I felt a cold draft despite the warm glow of the entity. It touched the side of my car and, for a second, the metal groaned like a cello string being plucked. The entity began to change again. Its outline started to expand, spilling out over the hood, mimicking the shape of my own hunched posture as I sat in the seat. Is it touching you? Clara's text arrived, but then 3 more appeared. Don't let it sit. It wants a place. The chair is empty. The entity wasn't just copying me. It was trying to inhabit my moment of stillness. It felt like a physical weight pressing against the glass of the windshield. I realized that the crowd wasn't just watching the entity. They were waiting for it to find its next host. Their eyes moved in a rapid, fluttering motion, scanning the space where I sat. Suddenly, the brushes stopped. The water drained away into the gutters with a loud, sucking sound. Silence fell over the tunnel, heavy and thick. The entity reached out and pressed against my face through the window, its golden warmth seeping into my skin. It began to solidify, losing its blurred edges and taking on the texture of velvet and light. In that moment, I felt it pull me into its memory. I felt the phantom sensation of sitting in a chair I hadn't yet sat in. The entity gave one final pulse of warmth, then settled into a perfect, motionless shape. It was no longer just an outline. It had captured my specific slouch, the way my chin rested on my chest, and the slight tilt of my brow. The crowd stood perfectly still, their golden eyes wide and unblinking, watching the transformation complete. I exhaled a long breath, feeling my own body become slightly lighter, as if a piece of my physical weight had been gifted to the gold light. I looked at the entity now. It was no longer just a shape in the tunnel. It was me, frozen in amber light. I climbed out of the car, my legs feeling strangely hollow, and turned back to look at the silhouette that remained in the driver's seat. The crowd began to move away into the shadows of the tunnel, their eyes still tracking me as I walked toward the exit. I reached for the door handle, but before I could pull it, the entity moved its hand, the golden outline of my own hand, and gripped the edge of the seat where my body had just been. I stepped out into the moonlight, and as I turned back one last time, The shape in the car sat up straight and smiled with a mouth that wasn't mine. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories and make sure to like.